this is the stick that stops it from doing the like falling up and down. So there's a way to loosen it, because this one is the one that allows it to go back and forth.
So I'm very happy to be in this fascinating, very interesting conference, and I'm grateful, like many of us, to Stefan Vigatz for the invitation to participate in it, and also he provided some ideas which pointed me in the direction of writing this paper. I'm sorry that he's not able to be with us, as he's now celebrating the life of his mother, but I know he's with us in spirit, and I believe also digitally. So thank you to Stefan. Okay. While Cardinal Cardine deserves credit, while Cardinal Cardine deserves credit for developing the See, Judge, Act method, he did not create it ex nihilo, out of nothing. It is, in fact, a development within the Catholic intellectual tradition with roots in pre-Christian pagan Greek philosophy. Plato's portrayal of the virtuous person and the virtuous city focuses on 4 virtues: wisdom, Sophia, courage, temperance, and justice. Now, within the city, wisdom is practical. It advises not about any particular thing in the state, but about the whole, and considers how a state can best deal with itself and with other states. Now, Aristotle, who was, like Cardinal Cardine, a realist, introduces a distinction between intellectual virtues and moral virtues, and within the intellectual virtues, between the virtues of the speculative intellect and those of the practical intellect. He includes wisdom with the speculative intellectual virtues, and practical wisdom, or prudence, with the practical intellectual virtues. Thus, what is one virtue for Plato becomes 2 for Aristotle, one speculative and the other practical. And Aristotle understands practical wisdom as a reasoned and true state of capacity to act with regard to human rights. And he also points out that becoming practically wise requires time and experience. While young men, and I apologize on behalf of Aristotle that he did not use inclusive language, but in his defense, not many other people in the 4th century BC did. But what he says about young men is certainly true also of young women. While young people become geometricians and mathematicians and wise in matters like these, it is thought that a young man of practical wisdom cannot be found. The cause is that such wisdom is concerned not only with universals, but with particulars, which become familiar from experience. But a young man has no experience, for it is a length of time that gives experience. Now, I've just observed that most of us at this conference, including myself, are relatively mature. I hope we can also get more young people. I'm glad there's some young people, but at least we have a lot of experience, hopefully good experience. Now, skipping to St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas' account of the virtues, which is both Aristotelian and Christian, adds a 3rd category, the theological virtues. He accepts Aristotle's distinction between wisdom and practical wisdom or prudence. and provides an analysis of the latter that is more systematic and detailed than Aristotle's. Within the while the moral virtues determine the ends at which we should aim, it belongs to prudence rightly to counsel, judge, and command concerning the means of obtaining a due end. And I would suggest that here we have intellectual roots of see, judge, act. Aquinas sometimes calls these three steps acts of practical reason. He says that prudence consists in acts of practical reason, counsel, judgment about what has been counseled, and command. At other times, he calls them simply acts of reason, with the first two speculative and only the third practical. He says, quote, "There are three acts of reason in respect of anything done by man. The first of these is counsel, the second judgment, the third command. The first two correspond to those acts of the speculative intellect, which are inquiry and judgment, for counsel is a kind of inquiry, but the third is proper to the practical intellect, insofar as this is ordained to operation." He explains that taking counsel belongs to discovery. The second act is to judge of what has been discovered. Finally, commanding consists in applying to action the things counseled and judged. Now, within the Catholic intellectual tradition, as most of you know, prudence is understood to be one of the four cardinal virtues. The other three are those that Plato included with wisdom in his discussion of the four most important virtues. That is justice, courage, or fortitude, and temperance. And the root of the word cardinal is the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. So four virtues are pivotal. Many lesser virtues hinge on those four. Aquinas identifies three potential parts or sub-virtues of the cardinal virtue of prudence. He explains that the potential parts of a virtue are the virtues connected with it, which are directed to certain secondary acts or matters, not having, as it were, the whole power of the principal virtue. Rather than providing Latin names for these three virtues, he leaves them in Aristotle's Greek. Now, I do not speak Greek, but so please forgive me for those of you who do, but I will say eubulia, or eubulia, synesis, and nome. Eubulia is the virtue of deliberating or taking counsel well. It signifies goodness of counsel, for it is derived from two Greek words meaning good and counsel. So this is the virtue of taking good counsel. Translating the names of the other two virtues is more challenging. Synesis is the virtue of good judgment in ordinary cases, those that conform to ordinary moral rules. The nome is the virtue of good judgment in extraordinary cases, when it is appropriate to set aside ordinary rules for the sake of some higher moral principle. So, in summary of Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the virtue of prudence, it involves three acts of reason, the first two more speculative, the third distinctively practical. They are counsel, judgment, and command. The sub-virtue of eubulia, or good counsel, corresponds to the act of counsel. The sub-virtues of synesis and nome correspond to the act of judgment. The cardinal virtue of prudence itself is about the chief act, that of commanding. Okay, now the Thomist theologian Walter Farrell offers an example to help us see the three acts of reason at work. This is his example. Let us suppose that the thing we are about to do is to go to a theater. That involves, first of all, a scanning of the list of plays actually in town. We are taking counsel. Then a selection of the best show would be necessary. We have made up our minds, passed a judgment. Finally would come the act of command, or precept, by which we get the tickets and go to the theater. If we stop at the act of counsel, we have obtained some information, but no entertainment. If our mental stamina carries us only as far as the act of judgment, we have material for argument, but still no entertainment. It is only by the last act, the act of command, that we actually obtain rest for our soul in the make-believe world of the theater. So although he does not relate this to see, judge, act, I would submit that we're talking about the same thing. Now, there are several other authors who understand Cardine's see, judge, act method to be rooted in the Thomistic virtue of prudence. So here's just three examples from three different books. According to Cleary, the methodology of see, judge, act, even if it owed something to Marxist praxis, came from Thomas Aquinas' teaching on prudence. From an author named Juncker, the see, judge, act method has its incipient development in Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, treatise on prudence and justice. And an author named Bushlack concurs. Aquinas defines prudence as right reason in action from the Summa. A simple way to summarize the stages of prudence is provided by the phrase see, judge, act. But if see, judge, act is rooted in Aquinas, then it is also rooted in Plato and Aristotle. Now, although Cardine may have learned the three acts of reason by reading Thomas Aquinas, it is more probable, since he was a man of action, not an academic philosopher or theologian, that he learned them from one of his professors or some contemporary author. One example of a Catholic professor who was teaching and publishing around the period when Cardine's thought was forming is the French philosopher Antonin Dalmas Sertillange, Dominican, who lived from 1863 to 1948. He took the name Antonin Gilbert when he entered religious life, so you'll sometimes find him as A.D. Sertillange and sometimes as A.G. Sertillange. He was professor of moral philosophy at the Institut Catholique de Paris and authored more than 24 books. In La philosophie morale de Saint Thomas d'Aquin, sorry, je ne parle pas français, but which was published in 1916, the first edition in 1916, Sertillange offers his own account of the three acts of reason involved in exercising the virtue of prudence. Since prudence is the rule of action, right reason applied to action, the various roles of prudence are postulates of action. The first is counsel, and I've given you the French word there. This book is not well translated. The first is counsel, which represents in morality discovery. To take counsel is, in effect, to seek. The second is judgment, which applies to that which has been found and approves it. The third, and most important of all, because it characterizes the virtue of prudence in relation to purely intellectual dispositions, is command. Now, I have no evidence that Cardan read Sir de Lange, but I think he's representative of French language Thomism at approximately the time when Cardan was studying. So if he didn't read him, he may have gotten it from a similar French language author. Now, the words that Sertolange uses in this passage to name the three postulates of action are rather traditional translations of Aquinas' Latin. Other authors and translators use other French words. For example, one passage in Aquinas' Summa, which says in English, counseling, judging, and commanding are acts of the practical reason, is translated by a French translator from Latin to French, as de libérer, juger et commander sont des actes de la raison pratique. The same passage in French. We have different French words here from Sertolange, and the second word then is identical to the second word in Cardan's formulation in French, to judge. Now we come closer to Cardan's French in the work of the philosopher Léon Olé-Laprune, who lived from 1839 to 1898. In 1955, and I owe this to Stefan, Cardan wrote a list of the authors he had read as a younger man, and he includes Olé-Laprune's name in the list. Now, in the preface to the third edition of L'Après de la Vie in 1894, Olé-Laprune writes of the need within the moral confusion and anarchy of his day to be capable to see clearly, to judge, and to conclude. And these are the three French words that he uses. In this formulation, two of the three words are identical to those of Cardan's formulation. Now, in 1881, Olé-Laprune published a book on Aristotle's moral theory, which includes the following passage. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so there's going from one word the same to two words the same as in Cardan's formulation in the French language. Okay, in Olé-Laprune's book on Aristotle's moral theory, he wrote about prudence or practical wisdom. Practical reason discerns what is to be done in every instance. It takes into account times and places and people. It appreciates the circumstances. It determines the conduct to be followed. These are practical definitions, not for theory, but for action. This prudence or practical wisdom is not a moral virtue, but is its condition, because it is its light. It is necessary to think well, to act well. Such is nature, such is the role of intelligence applied to the discernment of moral and enlightening matters, directing practical life. So this confirms that Olé-Laprune examined Aristotle's account of the virtue of prudence, and it is reasonable to assume that his own understanding of seeing, judging, and concluding was influenced by Aristotle's understanding of practical reason. And we do know that Cardan read at least some of Olé-Laprune's works, although I don't know which works he read. Okay, so I would just like to suggest that we should consider Cardan's See Judge Act to be a development of a long tradition, not merely a recent innovation. Out of context, just the three words could be misinterpreted. We should understand it within the tradition. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should go back to the 4th century BC or even to the 13th should understand it as a development within a tradition. Now, I would just like very briefly to contrast this tradition of practical wisdom, prudence, and see, judge, act to the dominant theory in contemporary philosophy and other disciplines of decision theory, which is expected utility theory. Now, this is very much in the tradition of positivism, which was mentioned in the previous talk. According to expected utility theory, in situations of uncertainty, we should choose the option with the greatest expected utility. And I believe that the tradition is a better way of thinking about decision making than this. The common good is complex. What expected utility theory tries to do is reduce many complex things, many different things, many of which cannot be quantified, to one abstract concept, utility, so then we can quantify it. And if we can quantify it, then we can do all kinds of mathematics with it. So this is positivism. This is where our culture is. That which we can observe empirically or quantify is important. Anything else is just values or opinion, and therefore not true or false. And yeah, in some situations, expected utility theory will work very well. For example, if you're managing a business and your goal is to maximize long-term shareholder value, then expected utility theory could be helpful in thinking about how you might accomplish that end. But I think for moral decision-making about promoting the common good, that thinking about everything in terms of maximizing utility is not a good way to do it. It's actually too simple. Mathematics, and going back to the quotation by Aristotle, that young people can excel in mathematics, but it takes experience to excel in practical wisdom. And I think it's a mistake to try to reduce practical wisdom to mathematics, and I believe the tradition in which see, judge, act stands is superior to expected utility theory when it comes to making moral decisions. So much more could be said about that, but I think I've used up my time. Thank you.
For that wonderful presentation. Looking forward to following up with you to learn more about the Thomistic roots of this wonderful methodology that's brought us here to Cincinnati. At this time, we are really out of time for this session for Q&A. We're running behind a little bit, so I'm sure all of you will have lots of questions for our presenters that I invite you to take up with them at lunch. I'm going to say we take a very brief break. I know people need to use the restroom. I know people want to grab coffee.